The other interesting thing that curious was how does Christianity, because there's a big Christian population there, isn't there?
There is.
How does that work? And has that been modified in the same way as, say, the Buddhist religion was modified by being in China?
Well, it's a very good question to which I have absolutely no answer, but there is, I mean, I constantly quote statistics since it always shocks Westerners who are told that Chinese persecute Christians and so on. Again, with reading this missionary, you see the ambivalent attitudes of the Chinese towards Christianity. And I'm learning more about it now. On the whole, they like the Catholics much more because Catholicism is much closer. It's a ritualistic and magical kind of religion, as Protestants point out. So, and it's much more, in some ways, more tolerant and absorbing. So the early Catholic missionaries like Matteo Ricci and so on were much more, in fact, they got into a lot of trouble even at home because they adapted Christianity. They said, you know, it's no good preaching this hard Christianity to these people. You've got to take it in stages. So they adapted early, and they sort of changed the names of saints, and they allowed people to do continue sort of ancestor worship, but said, how about calling this ancestor Saint Ignatius instead of your grandfather or something, that sort of thing. And I heard about this in Assam too from my mother, who worked with really liked the Catholic missionaries because she said they learnt the language, they became absorbed, and they tried to translate their Christianity into local terms and make it much more fit in with local cosmologies, whereas the Protestants were completely failures for a lot of the time. They just hung around on the coast, didn't go inland, and they didn't, because they preached a much more ascetic, and they called these people's gods demons and pagan. You know, they were much more critical. Not all of them, because I've just bought a very good book by a Methodist missionary, which looks as very understanding and so on. But anyway, so basically that gives me a hint that if you looked at Christianity, because there are more Christians in China now than there are members of the Communist Party.
Yeah, I've read that.
I mean, something like about 10% of the population of China are Christians. Now, it is puzzling because it appears to be the oil and the water syndrome. I mean, Christianity is monotheistic, it's intolerant, it's right and wrong, it's heaven and hell, it's post-axial, all this stuff. How can that work within China? Isn't it? But I suspect that what is happening and what has happened and what will happen is what happened to Buddhism. Because when Buddhism was brought in, at first, it tried to maintain its purity to a certain extent and be Buddhism. But gradually, and it took centuries, the real origins of Chan, modern Chinese Zen Buddhism, is 8th century, 7th, 8th century Tang. So it took 600 years of the Chinese drip, drip, drip feed onto Buddhism to really make it Chinese Buddhism. Now, I suspect Christianity is only 300-400 years old, and it was banished for whiles and came back. And so you're really talking about a 19th century, mid-19th century phenomenon. So 150 years. And then it under Mao and others, it was banned again. So probably pretty recent. And what I suspect is that it will adapt itself. And what it can lose, there's a very good, a wonderful novel by Japanese novelist Endo called something like can you remember what the Endo's book was called? The Missionaries or something. It was about Portuguese or Spanish missionaries going to Japan, and on the boat they were saying, how can we possibly deal with these people? They don't even have a concept of sin. They don't have a concept of God. the basic things they need to be Christians are absent. How can, and that is a problem with, if you're dealing with people. And this again is a fascinating discussion in Huck. He keeps saying these people don't have religion. It's not just that they don't have Christianity. They don't know what religion is. They don't have the basic, I mean, Ronald Knox, I don't know if you've read Ronald Knox, but he's a great Calvinist or Scottish writer. He wrote a book called Enthusiasm, and he had a short story or a fantasy that religion was a gland that you had in the back of your neck. So if you had this religious gland, you were religious, and if you had an operation, you could take it out again. And he speculated on the consequences of such a, but that's basically what Huck is saying. These people don't have a religious gland. They don't know, they don't have a word. There's no word for religion. They don't, when you talk about God, they say, well, tell me what about it. And once you start describing him, they fall about laughing. They said, can you see him? No. Can you touch him? No. Have you heard him? No. And then, is he all powerful? Yes. So what about that hurricane we had last week? Problem of sin, suffering and so on. So the Chinese just laugh at the concept. They think it's ridiculous. And this is what the Japanese felt. I mean, in that mission that I've talked about going to America, the Japanese said, these Americans are superstitious and ridiculous. They have this ridiculous notion of God, a God, and the rest of it. But we have to humor them. So Huck says, the task of, he was a Lazarite missionary, it's impossible, more or less, because you've got, the philosophical problem of a fixed point. Then you can turn the world. You cannot find within a Chinese the fixed point of the need for a religion or the concept of religion. So to persuade them to build up on that, there's no cogito from which you can have ergo sum. There is no fixed. So how does Christianity work? I must ask more about this
because that seems to me as interesting a dilemma, really, as the question about how did science get going in China, given what and it feeds back into your idea that you can mix and match anything, because like you say, this is oil and water. If and you've got a Chinese Christians in China, but for the reasons you just said, that shouldn't be possible. how's it working? Because that would be quite an interesting one, wouldn't it? Because that would actually point ways to how we can actually move together and work together, the two civilizations.
It is, unless we solve those sort of problems, a Muslim living in,
because there's Muslims there as well, aren't there?
A lot. I mean, extraordinary number. Huck gives an example that in the 9th century, I think it was, some warlord arose and he attacked one of the coastal towns, and he slew or killed 200,000 Muslims and Christians. That there were 200,000 Christians and Muslims living in an Eastern Chinese town in the 9th century. Extraordinary. Anyway, I mean, they're old Muslim things. So the problem with that solution, I mean, with science, you can keep it in a pocket. You can, you're a scientist in the day and then you're a Chinese in the evening. In theory, with Christianity, it is a way of being and a way of existing. It's not a rational sort of activity like science. Therefore, the idea that, I mean, for the Chinese, it's the solution. The Chinese government don't care about Christians as long as they don't have an allegiance to the Pope, which they've agreed, and the Pope has agreed that the Chinese vet the bishops and so on and so on. So basically, politics dominates religion, and the Catholic Church has accepted this, much to the anger of many Catholics in the rest of the world. but basically they've done a deal. And Sarah is pointing me to the watch.
Yep.
But
It's only like Amazon, isn't it? Or they've done deals as well, haven't they?
Exactly. But basically, you can't so easily do that. So the Chinese can say, okay, well, 100,000 Christians, as long as they, pay some attention to, they pay their taxes and so on and so on. They take the attitude of the British towards Hindus and so on, as long as they can have their fine private beliefs. But for the private belief person, as is the question, how can you be both Chinese and a Christian? All the other things. For example, Christianity preaches that men and women are equal. Now, for many Chinese, men and women are not equal. The Chinese, Christianity says, forget your father and your mother and follow me. Now, for a Chinese, that is absolutely appalling. You can't do that. So there appear to be philosophical problems of being a Chinese and a Christian.